Hello, my name is Robert Kenefick. I'm a research physiologist from the Thermal Mountain Medicine Division from the U.S. Army Research Institute of Environmental Medicine. And what I want to talk about today is the hydration debate, making sense of mixed messages. It's important before I give this presentation to let you know that the statements that I'm going to give you are mine alone and they don't represent Gatorade, Gatorade Sports Science Institute, or the Department of Defense. So the title of the presentation today is The Hydration Debate, Making Sense of Mixed Messages. So just what is this debate in particular? And how long has it been going on? Well, I've just written a piece in Sports Medicine last year, and it's received a number of letters on this particular topic. But the idea or the controversy goes back, well, we can go back to about 2007. If you look at this point-counterpoint in Medicine, Science, Sport, and Exercise, you can see that Dr. Michael Sacca debated this topic of dehydration and impairment to exercise performance, and he had this debate with Dr. Timothy Noakes. And you can see here from the slide is that Dr. Sacca concludes that greater than 2% body mass loss, or 3% total body water, impairs exercise performance, particularly in warm environments, particularly aerobic exercise performance, and there's probably a number of mechanisms responsible. Dr. Noakes says that you can drink to thirst, and that should be sufficient, and that greater than 10% body mass losses have been recorded, and there's been no impact on performance. So he proposes that drinking to thirst is perfectly sufficient. This point-counterpoint debate is continued more recently, and this is published in 2016 in Wilderness and Environmental Medicine, and Dr. Marty Hoffman had a debate with Larry Armstrong et al. And what Marty talked about is that drinking to thirst is adequate to maintain hydration status during prolonged exercise, whereas Larry Armstrong said that drinking to thirst during prolonged exercise was probably going to need a programmed drinking approach. So what I'm going to do before I even get into the presentation is tell you what are the main points right off the bat. We call this bluff, or bottom line up front. So when we're talking about this idea of drinking to thirst versus programmed drinking, we know that both of these strategies have the same goal. They both want to prevent over or under hydration, and they both want to preserve performance. But what I would say is that the success of either strategy depends on the context of the situation. And these situations include the characteristics of the event, the duration, the intensity, and the environment. It includes the participant characteristics, what are their fitness level, acclimatization status, body size. And it should also include the goals of the athlete, whether somebody's trying to do something for performance, and that's a specific goal of theirs, or whether or not they're doing something just to finish, and it's more recreational. So what I'd like to do first is tell you what I'm going to tell you, and then I'm going to tell you, and then I'll tell you what I told you. So we'll look through some of the terminology and what the purpose of drink to thirst versus programmed drinking is. I'll talk a little bit about the physiology of thirst. I'll talk about the sensitivity of thirst and maintaining hydration. I'll get into some of the research about thirst-guided drinking, look at dehydration research. I'm going to touch base on the discrepancies in this research. I'll talk about programmed drinking, and then I'll make my own recommendations based on my take of the literature. So let's first look at some of the terminology. So for the purpose of this presentation, we're going to define programmed drinking as a pre-established drinking program. And you can see that I have a reference here, the ACSM position statement from 2007, and you'll see throughout the presentation I have many references. This is for two reasons: to show you that what I'm presenting you has a scientific backing, and it also allows you to go back and look at any of this information in greater depth. The idea of drinking to thirst, or the definition, is using the sensation of thirst as the only stimulus to drink. Now you'll see, if you look in the literature, this idea of ad libitum drinking, and this idea of ad libitum, or the definition, is consuming fluid whenever and in whatever volume desired. And so these two terms, drinking to thirst and ad libitum, have been shown, and you can see here there are two citations, one from Tamara Hugh Butler and another from Larry Armstrong, that says that these two terms, drinking to thirst and drinking ad libitum, are synonymous, and that's how we're going to talk about them today. So why drink to thirst? Why is this idea important? So we're going to look at the statement of the Third International Exercise-Associated Hyponatremia Consensus Development Conference. And we're going to look at what their purposes were. And what they say is drinking to thirst, as you can see on the slide, minimizes hyponatremia. And that appears to be one of their major focuses. But you can also see that drinking to thirst, as they propose, also maintains plasma osmolality, it prevents excessive dehydration, and it helps maintain plasma volume. Now, the American College of Sports Medicine has a different emphasis. And basically what they're saying is because there's a considerable variability in sweating rates and the electrolyte content between individuals, a customized fluid replacement program is recommended. And the purposes of this programmed drinking recommendation is to prevent excess dehydration, greater than 2% body mass loss, prevent heat illnesses such as heat exhaustion, heat stroke, prevent hyponatremia, and also to prevent the degradation in performance. And this is also associated with maintaining cardiovascular stability and maintaining thermoregulatory responses. Well, what about some of the guidelines that are out there? We can see that the guidelines from the American College of Sports Medicine in 2007, FACSM more recently in 2016, a recent National Athletic Trainer Association position stand, and the United States Amateur Track and Field Association all make a similar recommendation that fluid intake should be approximated to sweat losses, and we should prevent greater than 2% body mass loss. And it also talk about ingestion of carbohydrate between 30 and 60 grams of carbohydrate an hour, and this is for fuel. Now, the International Medical Marathon Directors Association, which is no longer operating, recommends that drinking ad libitum or thirst should be sufficient, and that you shouldn't drink any more than 0.4 to 0.8 liters per hour. So who's right? Well, both of these programs, both of these recommendations want to do the same thing. They want to prevent dehydration, they want to prevent the performance decline, the decline in cardiovascular and thermoregulation responses, and reduce heat injury. And they also want to prevent hyponatremia, drinking too much fluid. So we want to get into this, what we would call this Goldilocks range of what is optimal fluid intake, but what program is going to be the best in helping make that happen. So let's talk a little bit about the physiology of thirst and the sensitivity of thirst in helping maintain hydration. Here's a statement: unequivocal water conservation and acquisition responses do not occur until a threshold level of dehydration is reached. Now that seems rather confusing. So what we can do is look at some of the physiological responses to dehydration and look at how that plays a role with thirst. Now you can see on this slide, what we're really talking about is the dehydration that occurs when we sweat. This is sweating thermoregulation. Now this fluid loss is different than the fluid loss you would see with vomiting or diarrhea or what occurs when you're at altitude. So what we're talking about here is a hypertonic hypovolemia, which I'll talk about more in greater detail later in the talk. But what's happening here is that when you begin to exercise, you're generating heat, and that heat from the muscle gets transferred into the blood, and that blood is carried out to the periphery of the skin, which is why your skin gets red when you're exercising. That heat at the skin must be dissipated, and that's where sweating comes from. So sweating goes onto the surface of the skin, and it's the evaporation of that sweat that carries away the heat. So what happens is as we're losing that fluid, your volume gets lower, and you can see here we're looking at a decrease in plasma volume. But what happens is as you lose that plasma volume, as you lose sweat, the constituents in your sweat, principally sodium, is actually lower than what's in your plasma. So as you sweat more, the sodium, principally sodium, in your plasma volume increases. So that concentration goes up. So what we're seeing is with thermoregulatory sweating is a decrease in plasma volume and an increase in plasma sodium, which goes along hand in hand with an increase in plasma osmolality. And these two things are the triggers for thirst. So what we see here, an increase in plasma osmolality triggers a release of antidiuretic hormone, or arginine vasopressin, and that causes renal water conservation, so your urine becomes more concentrated. and it also stimulates thirst. So you have water acquisition, drive to drink, and you have conservation of water at the site of the kidney. Now we know there's a lot of other reasons that people take in fluid, but for the most part, fluid intake occurs with meals. About 20% of your fluid occurs with every meal that you eat. But humans take in fluid for other reasons outside of thirst. There are social and psychological reasons, and there's also other circumstances in which you might feel thirsty. So there's also a situation called xerostomia, which is dry mouth, and people take in fluid for fuel intake, as we said before. So what are some of the historical observations about thirst? Well, I've gone through the literature and looked at some of the greats in physiology who've done work in this area and taken a number of quotes to show you from their actual field observations. And this first one is from D.B. Dill. Man undergoes a decrease in body weight when water is drunk ad libitum, or to thirst. And that's in 1933. We see a quote here from Bean and Eichner from 1943. No man drank enough water voluntarily to replace that lost by sweating while working, and all developed water deficits. Another quote in 1945 from Eichner. Since it lags behind water need, thirst constitutes an insensitive guide to the water replacement. And lastly, we see in 1964 from Johnson, over the short period, thirst is often suppressed, even though a progressive dehydration in water is being incurred. And here, if we look a little bit more specifically at animals, mammals, so humans compared to other animals like dogs or burros or camels, most large mammals, including all the ones that I just mentioned, rehydrate very rapidly after water's lost. Man rehydrates much more slowly when water is lost by sweating or water deprivation. And I like this observation from Dill in 1933. When a man and dog walked 32K in a hot environment, the dog maintained its weight, while the man lost 3 kg of his body weight, but water was available to both ad libitum. We see this lack of fluid intake that's matched to fluid losses very well described by Greenleaf in the Journal of Applied Physiology in 1965. What we can see here on this slide, on the y-axis, is ad libitum fluid intake, or drinking to thirst. And on the x-axis, we see sweat losses. So we're looking at individuals exercising at lower temperatures, where they lost around 400 mLs an hour, and higher temperatures, where they lost around 1200 mLs an hour. And what you see is their fluid intake is about half of what they lost in either environment. So what Greenleaf demonstrated in this study was that ad libitum drinking results in about 50% fluid replacement relative to the sweat losses. Interestingly, also in this study, Greenleaf had this quote: in trials where subjects were dehydrated by as much as 4 liters during the time where they were recovering, subjects showered and dressed, they stated they felt fully recovered and not particularly thirsty, even though they had a deficit of 4 to 5 liters of fluid. Let's talk a little bit about the sensitivity of thirst. So we're looking at a paper from Larry Armstrong, and this is in 2014. What we can see on this slide on the x-axis is a 19-hour change in body mass, and on the y-axis is ratings of thirst. You can see from the box here where we look at 1, where is a rating of not being thirsty at all, and a 9 being very, very thirsty. We draw a line in the sand of about 3, where people start to feel thirsty. And this is usually accompanied by a body weight loss of around 1 to 2%. So we can see here, everything above 3 we would consider thirsty. And we can see here, this is everything that's below 1% body mass loss. And what's interesting here is that you see individuals who state that they feel thirsty, they have a thirst rating greater than 3, but yet they haven't lost enough mass to trigger that thirst response. They haven't lost enough fluid. So we would consider that a false positive. And what we see here are individuals who have had fluid losses in excess of 1% of body mass, but they don't report feeling thirsty. So we would consider those reports as false negatives. So let's summarize these observations on thirst. Well, thirst works very well at rest, but thirst develops after dehydration is present and it's alleviated before euhydration is achieved. Usually, thirst is not perceived until a 2% body mass loss has occurred. And what I'm not going to talk about in this presentation, but there's plenty of literature out there, is that there is a limited application of thirst to older individuals. Let's talk a little bit about some of the research out there about thirst-guided drinking. So let's look at this study looking at ad libitum drinking during marathon running by my colleague, Dr. Sam Chavant. In this study, Dr. Chavant looked at 14 studies. This is of marathon running. And these marathons had performances anywhere from 2 hours, 10 minutes to 4 hours in a variety of environments from 10 to 28C. And Dr. Chavant assumed that the drinking during these events was going to be ad libitum, or when water was available. What we can see here on a y-axis is a percent body mass loss. And you can see that there's a gray box here for representing everything that's greater than 2% body mass losses, and we'll talk about why that's important in a few minutes. And you can see here that the finishing times on the x-axis. And what Sam concluded was that many of these individuals drinking ad libitum incurred water deficits far greater than 2% body mass loss throughout the entire range of performances. So we see here Dr. Chavant's work would say that ad libitum drinking results in water deficits greater than 2% body mass loss. So now let's look at some of the other literature out there. I've divided this out into a few different areas, and the first one we're going to look at is at ultra running. These are 3 studies by Netchell and 2 studies by Marty Hoffman, and these are endurance marathons lasting anywhere from 100K to 161 miles. We can see here also that the environments are relatively cool, but in some cases they get up to 38C. But you look at the conclusions from these studies is that there were individuals drank ad libitum, that there was no hyponatremia during these events, that body mass losses of even as much as 3% didn't impact performance whatsoever. And the overall conclusions from these studies is that drinking beyond thirst isn't required to maintain hydration during these type of ultra events. If we look at another set of studies, now these are marathon and half marathon studies. These authors include Dairies and Noakes, Dr. Noakes, who we already talked about, Buys and Dion. And we're looking at half marathons and marathon events, some of which are actually run outside and some of which were performed on treadmills. And their conclusions are that plasma osmolality and volume didn't differ between programmed drinking and drinking to thirst. Performance wasn't impaired. That individuals could have large body mass losses which didn't impact performance. And heart rate and core temperature may have been a little bit different, but there were no large differences in performance. What we're looking at here on this slide is ad libitum drinking for cycling time trial studies. And we can see that we're looking at 3 studies by Jonathan Dugas and Tim Noakes, by Berkalow and Noakes, and by Costas. And you can see these events range anywhere from 40K to 80K. They're performed in a variety of environments, but principally warmer environments. And the conclusions of these studies were that thermoregulation wasn't affected by fluid ingestion, that performance wasn't improved when drinking beyond ad libitum, and that fluid ingestion ad libitum, or not at all, had no impact on cardiovascular responses or thermoregulatory responses. So what can we conclude from all of this literature? Well, what they would say overall, aside from the work from Dr. Chavant, is that plasma osmolality and volume aren't different between drinking to thirst and ad libitum drinking and programmed drinking, that there was no impact on thermoregulatory responses, that there was a small, in some cases small, impact on cardiovascular responses, that losses of 2 to 3% of body mass or up to 10% body mass losses had no impact on performance, and that drinking beyond thirst is not recommended, and drinking to thirst also leads to no incidences of hyponatremia. So let's take a look at some of the dehydration research. This is some of the classic studies that have been done in this area. And so what I want to first start off with is what I talked about earlier in the presentation, is what happens when we exercise. So what we've said, dehydration occurs when there's a mismatch between fluid input and fluid output. And sweat losses and water unavailability are really the reasons behind that. And what we're seeing here is this description by Dr. Michael Sokov in his paper of 1996, demonstrating what happens when we exercise and we begin to lose body water. So you can see here on the x-axis is the percent decline in total body water. And you see in both panels we're seeing the decline in plasma volume. So we're losing hypotonic fluid, we're losing hypotonic sweat. And as we lose that sweat, our plasma volume declines. Well, as we've also said, because that sweat is hypotonic, it doesn't have a lot of sodium in it, the concentration of sodium within your plasma goes up, thus your osmolality goes up. So you can see we have what's called a hyperosmotic hypovolemic state. So what occurs from this hyperosmotic hypovolemic state? Well, here's a study by my colleague Dr. Scott Montaigne in 1992. And what Scott did was he looked at varying levels of body weight losses. So varying levels of dehydration, anywhere from 1 to 4% body weight loss. This is during cycling exercise at 60% of VO2 max in a warm environment, 33°C, 50% humidity. And what we can see here in the first panel on the left is heart rate on the y-axis and time on the x, is that individuals with a 1% body mass loss have a lower heart rate, but as you see, greater increments of body weight loss lead to greater increases in heart rate during steady state exercise. And you really can see that this differentiates after about an hour of activity. We know that there's a relationship between heart rate and ratings of perceived exertion, and the panel on the right shows this relationship, RPE on the y-axis and time on the x, and we see, just as we saw with the increases in heart rate, a matched response in ratings of perceived exertion where individuals perceive the work to be harder as the level of dehydration increases. This is a classic study from Jose Alonso Gonzalez, published in 2000. And what we see here are a number of interactions between dehydration and environment. So what Dr. Alonso did here was look at dehydration of 1 to 5% body mass loss during exercise in 8C and 35C. So we can see on the panel, if we start off with the very bottom one, looking at stroke volume on the y-axis, and we see our percent of dehydration. The darker squares represent the hotter environment, and the clear squares are the 8C environment. And what you can see is that stroke volume becomes significantly lower when we have higher degrees of body mass loss or greater degrees of dehydration. So we're looking at that 3 to 4% dehydration. When you have a lower stroke volume, we have an increase in heart rate to try to compensate that. If we look at the next panel up at heart rate, we see greater heart rates, particularly at these higher degrees of dehydration. If we look at cardiac output, it is maintained, but it begins to decrease as we get into the higher levels of dehydration, 3 and 4%. And mean arterial pressure is maintained throughout exercise, but we can see that it is a little lower in the hotter environment. Here we're looking at another study by Dr. Scott Montaigne in 1997, and what Scott looks at here is the interaction between exercise intensity and degree of dehydration. So if we look at the top, we're looking at a change in stroke volume. The first set of panels shows a 3% body weight loss at 25% of VO2 max, 45 and 65% of VO2 max. And what you can see is there's a greater change in stroke volume with the higher exercise intensities, and we can see that that change in stroke volume is much larger when we have a higher body weight loss, and in this panel a 5% body weight loss. And we also see the same type of relationship when we look at the bottom panel, looking at the change in cardiac output. Larger changes or decrements in cardiac output with the higher exercise intensities, particularly at the higher body weight losses or higher percentages of dehydration. Well, what kind of consequences does this hyperosmotic hypovolemia have on our ability to thermoregulate? It's another study by Dr. Michael Saka, published in 1989. And what we see here on the left panel is core temperature on the x-axis and sweating rate on the y. What we see is that with a 5% body weight loss or a 5% degree of dehydration, we see a rightward shift in core temperature. So it takes a higher core temperature to initiate a sweating response. Dr. Larry Kenny showed something that goes hand in hand with this in 1990, is that there's also a rightward shift in forearm blood flow. So there's a change in the ability to get that blood out to the skin so that heat can be dissipated, and that's specifically related to that hyperosmotic state. What we see here is the result of that delay in thermoregulation with dehydration. We see here times during steady state exercise at 25% of VO2 max in a warm environment, 49C. And we're looking at this relationship of time and esophageal temperature. And so what you can see again is a graded response to dehydration between euhydrated at the bottom all the way up to a 7% body weight loss. And you can see is that what we achieve is a offset or a new steady state in core temperature, or an esophageal temperature in this case, and it's higher for each level of dehydration. So what can we conclude from all of these studies on dehydration? Well, we know that there's a decrease in stroke volume and an increase in heart rate and a decrease in cardiac output. So there's definitely an increase in cardiovascular strain. We know there's a change in the temperature threshold to start sweating, and there's a decrease in sweating rate and a decrease in skin blood flow to get that heat out to the skin. These responses result in an elevated core temperature during exercise. And as I said previously, it's related to hypovolemia in hyperosmotic state. And all of these responses are mediated by the degree of dehydration, by the environment, how hot it is, and by the exercise intensity itself. And what we see is there's a greater impact of dehydration with higher body weight losses or body water losses in hotter environments and with higher exercise intensities. So let's take a little bit of a look at performance and what happens with dehydration and performance. We go back in history and look at some early observations. This is Edward Adolph in his classic Man in the Desert, published in 1947. Now what Adolph did is he gave individuals certain amounts of fluid, anywhere from no fluid, 0 liters, up to 10 liters, put them out into the desert and said, go hike as far as you can. And what we see here on the x-axis is the environmental temperature, and on the y-axis is how many kilometers or how many miles they were able to hike. And what you can see is that if you give an individual a lot of fluid, 10 liters, and it's a rather cool environment, 32°C, or relatively cool, 32°C and 90 degrees Fahrenheit, they can actually hike pretty far, upwards of 50 miles. But if you don't give them any fluid, 0 liters, and it's very, very hot, like 49°C, you can see that they'll go less than 10 miles. So there's definitely a relationship between fluid availability or the degree of dehydration and your ability to perform work. Here's another study by my colleague, Dr. Sam Shervant, published in 2004 and 2005. And what Dr. Shervant did in this study was he looked at a body water loss of 3% and looked at aerobic exercise performance, and this is a time trial performance, in a cool environment, 2°C, and in a warm environment, 40°C. And what we can see is that dehydration definitely has a graded response or a graded impact on exercise performance when you get to hotter environments. We see a less than 5%, probably around a 2.5% decline in performance at 2°C, but upwards of near a 20% decline in 40°C with a 3% body weight loss. If we look at a lot of the literature that's out there, and this is all the way back into 1966, what I've done here is try to show a variety of studies show a variety of different environments and body weight losses. But what I really want to point out here is that many of these studies, despite their differences in the degree of dehydration in the environment, we see that there is a decline or a change in VO2 max in the majority of these studies, and physical work capacity also is degraded to varying degrees with all of these different degrees of dehydration. So the literature in this area seems to be pretty consistent. This is something published in the Comprehensive Physiology chapter, published by myself and Dr. Shrivant in 2014. And what Dr. Shrivant and I did was go through all of the literature at the time and count up the number of statistically significant p less than 0.05 declines in exercise performance with dehydration. So we start with 2% body mass loss and we go all the way up to 7%. And you can see here is what we put on the top of each bar, the number of observations that showed a significant decline in performance relative to the total number of observations. So you can see a 2% loss, 14 of 26 observations showed a statistical decline. As we get up to 3%, you can see 8 of 13 showed a decline. As we get to 4%, 12 of 13, 5%, 4 of 5, and then the greater numbers, there are fewer and fewer studies at these high levels because they're very difficult to achieve in a research setting. And you can see out of the 1 and 2 observations at 6 and 7%, they both showed a statistically significant decline in performance. So if we look at the dehydration literature and performance, what could we conclude from that? Well, dehydration degrades physical work capacity, and that's relative to the environment and the body weight loss or body water loss. Dehydration degrades submaximal exercise performance, muscle endurance, and I put a question by VO2 max, although most of the studies have shown a decline in VO2 max or VO2 peak. And you can see from our own look at, myself and Dr. Shrivant, look at the literature out there, 68% of all endurance exercise studies show a degradation in performance that is statistically significant. So let's look at some of the discrepancies. Because when we looked at some of the drink to thirst literature, it seemed that drink to thirst seemed perfectly fine. And then we looked at the dehydration literature, predominantly lab studies, it showed degradations in performance. So why is there a difference between these two bodies of literature? Well, if we look at the drink to thirst literature, what we can say about that literature as a whole is that a lot of these studies are observational versus what we see in a lab, which is be considered more experimental. Some of these studies use pre and post-event questionnaires. Some of these studies extrapolate fluid intake and body mass loss. Many of these events are of 2 hours or less in duration, and the ones that are longer, like the ultramarathons, are usually of lower exercise intensities, and they typically are contested in lower ambient temperatures with wind speeds. And the important point I want to make is that all of the individuals in these studies, or in these competitions, begin exercise in a euhydrated state. So they're well hydrated when they start, and they dehydrate progressively as the event goes on. And so we don't see a 2% body mass loss achieved until we get towards the end of the event. Thus, performance is not impacted. What about the laboratory research? Well, literature supports that dehydration impairs cardiovascular responses, thermoregulatory function, and exercise performance. It's relative to the degree of dehydration, to heat stress, to the exercise intensity. But it's very important to note that most of these studies have demonstrated their findings with body weight losses that were established prior to a performance trial. And as I said just previously, most individuals don't show up to a starting line to perform competition in a dehydrated state. Some of these dehydration levels are far greater than 2% body weight loss, and as we've seen, anywhere from 4 to maybe upwards of 6%. A lot of this literature is done in very, very hot environments and cool environments. Most of these lab studies have minimal airflows. They have very high exercise intensities. And some of the studies have very, very high skin temperatures where they use instruments like perfused suits to really jack up skin temperature to get that very hot, which would not actually ever occur in a real world scenario. So what we can kind of conclude from much of this literature is that the results of the studies may be exaggerated relative to the strain of the environment and its impact on performance. So let's take a look at programmed drinking itself. So what I've done in 2012, I've published this in Nutrition Reviews, is I've taken a sweat prediction equation. This is an equation that's developed to actually predict how much fluid loss would occur depending on the environment and the pace and the individual. And so what I've done is I've taken two individuals, a lighter individual, 60 kg, you can see represented here in the white bars, and an 80 kg individual represented by the speckled bars. And I've calculated out their sweat losses for 4 different events, for the 5K, 10K, half marathon, and marathon distances. And I've done this in 2 different environments, at 22C and 30C. And in this first slide, I've done it at a moderate pace. So what you can see, the moderate pace for the 5K, for the 10K, and the 21K leads to sweat losses that don't even approach 2% body mass loss, which is represented by that dotted line. And you don't actually achieve 2% loss until you hit the 42K or the marathon distance, and that doesn't occur towards the end of the event. So remember, that's what we see in a cool, moderate-paced event for both a 60 kg and 80 kg individual. If we look at a hotter environment, 30C, for all of these events, we begin to see individuals beginning to lose around 1.5% of body mass or 1.5% level of dehydration by about the half marathon mark. And by the end of the marathon, they'll be well over, approaching 3% for the larger individual in 30C. So this would suggest that somewhere between half marathon and marathon, they're going to become dehydrated, or they're going to be dehydrated at a level greater than 2%, where we would see a performance degradation and impacts on thermoregulation. If we do this for faster paced individuals, again, in a cool and warm environment, same 2 body mass sizes, but these are much faster events for the 5K through 42K, you can say even in the cooler environment, we begin to approach the 2% line at the half marathon, and we're definitely over it by the marathon, again saying that individuals will become dehydrated greater than 2% body mass loss somewhere between the half marathon and the finish of a marathon. If we look at a warmer environment, you can see that both individuals will achieve a 2% body mass loss in the half marathon and will be approaching upwards of 4% in a marathon. So all of what I've done here in this prediction would say that individuals will have to think about drinking in order to prevent dehydration, which will occur in longer duration activities. So let's take a look at programmed drinking itself. So what I've done here is created a scenario to show programmed drinking during an event. In this case, it's a marathon in 14 degrees C for a 60 kg individual. In both of these slides, we see the red box in the bottom representing a 2% body mass loss, and then we see the red line on the top representing a 2% body mass gain. And what we see here is that an individual who has about a quarter of a liter sweat rate, of 0.28 liters an hour, if they were to drink 1 liter an hour, they would become hyperhydrated. They would become over 2% body mass gain by about 18K, and that is something that should be avoided. If they didn't drink any fluid at all, 0, they would become 2% dehydrated by about the end of the marathon. But if they drank about a half a liter, that's a little bit more than they need, as their sweat rate is about a quarter of a liter, they'll be right in between this 2% body mass gain and a 2% body mass loss. If we look at the other scenario of a 2-hour 10 marathon with an individual of about a sweat rate of about a liter an hour, if they drink a liter an hour, they'll maintain a euhydrated state. if they drink half a liter an hour, they'll become near 2% dehydrated by the end of the event. And if they drink nothing, they'll be greater than 2% body mass loss or 2% dehydrated by about 24K. So based on what I've been able to program and my take on the literature, I'd like to make some recommendations. So does drink to thirst or program drinking apply to all situations? Well, what I would recommend based on what I've talked to you today about is that there are circumstances where drink to thirst may be perfectly sufficient. These are shorter duration exercise events of an hour to 90 minutes, particularly in cooler environments with lower exercise intensities. But circumstances where drink to thirst may not be sufficient is during longer duration activities greater than 90 minutes, particularly in the heat, particularly with high intensity exercise, and with individuals who have high sweat rates, and particularly for individuals who have a concern about their exercise performance. When performance is a concern, individuals should determine their sweat rates under conditions that are going to be synonymous with how they're going to compete. So that would include the pace and the environment. They should tailor a drinking program to prevent a 2% body mass loss or a 2% body mass gain. So it's important to never drink so much that weight is gained. And despite low fluid losses with slower paces in a warm, hot environment, events greater than an hour should consider taking in carbohydrate electrolyte, and that can be done through a number of different food sources. Lastly, we know that team sports are very important, and so what program would be applicable to these types of events? Well, technically, either strategy is difficult in a team sports setting, but either one would probably work, and a lot of it depends on the context of the team sport. How many breaks do they have? How long is a competition? What is the modality of it? Is it an aerobic event versus an anaerobic type event? What about the characteristics of the participants? What's their attire, their equipment? What about their acclimatization status? And what about the environment itself? Are they playing indoors versus outdoors? Is it cold? Is it hot? It's important, though, that athletes should always practice hydration strategies before reaching competition. And with that, I will end the presentation.